So hello and welcome to today's webinar on how to close out the year in your Microsoft Dynamics GP solution. I'm Matthew Formisano, a Market Response Coordinator at LBMC Technology Solutions. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. All phone lines have been muted to eliminate any background noise. If you experience any technical difficulties, please let us know by using the chat panel. We will be taking questions throughout today's webinar, so feel free to submit them at any time. You can submit your question via the questions panel in WebEx. This webinar is eligible for CPE. In order to qualify for CPE credit, you must stay on the entire session and answer all of the polling questions when prompted. If you have any issues with the polling questions, please either take a screenshot or send a chat message to us. We will also be recording this session and sending that out in a few days' time. At this time, I would like to introduce you to Sandy Wickman. Sandy serves as our Senior Business Consultant for Dynamics GP with LBMC Technology Solutions. She has over 20 years of experience with GP. Thank you again for joining us, and Sandy, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Matthew. So, congratulations. Your company has survived yet another year. Seems like there are more and more challenges that we have to face to be able to get to this. And so I just want to say congratulations to all of you who are participating today. Our session today is going to be following along with a Training Dynamo workbook. It's a Microsoft Dynamics GP year-end closing workbook that our friend at Training Dynamo created for us that gives you a basis and an ongoing workbook to be able to use in your organization. And so if you chose to purchase that workbook, I'll be calling out the page numbers as we go along through today's session. I'll also be going back and forth between the slide deck, which you see currently, and the actual GP application where I'll be showing you the actual steps that we're talking about so you can see them in action. I do encourage you to enter any questions that you have in the chat. I'll stop periodically and check in with Matthew to see if we have any questions so that they don't get too far beyond what we're actually talking about, so they'll be in context for you to be able to get answers to any questions. So off we go. So one of the things that I would just say right off the bat is that if you can improve your month-end close or your period end, we refer to them interchangeably because not everyone uses the same period as a month. So if you can improve your month-end close, your year-end close will be easy. The biggest issue that we'll discuss is the importance of balancing the general ledger and the subledgers. So that happens on a periodic or monthly basis. So our agenda today is that we're going to look first at some pre-close tasks and checklists, and then we're going to walk through the distribution series, which is purchase order, sales order, and inventory. Then we'll go through the core modules, which are described as receivables, tax, and payables. Finance modules, which is fixed assets and general ledger, and we will not be covering payroll in this session. We will not cover the payroll closing in this session. There is a separate webinar that was scheduled that includes the payroll closing. So if you haven't already signed up for that additional payroll closing webinar, I would encourage you to do that if you're using GP Payroll. So this diagram really just talks to the fact that there is a sequence or a progression that you should use when you're closing GP. So you should always begin with those distribution series, then move on to the core modules, additional modules if you use those, and then finally the general ledger. What's the secret to a pain-free year-end close? And here again, it just is an indication that it's really all about that period end or month end closing. So we're going to look at setting up smart list reports to verify our customers, vendors, items, GL accounts. We're going to look at unposted transactions. We'll post all those transactions and batches for the period. We're going to balance our subledgers to the GL each month and then finally close the fiscal period. In the Dynamics GP, the year-end close for the general ledger summarizes all of the activity of your profit and loss accounts for the fiscal year and creates an entry to the retained earnings accounts. So all those P&L accounts are going to roll up into retained earnings. If your accounts are marked for balance sheet types, then the year-end close process for general ledger pushes those final balances of balance sheet accounts into the beginning balance field for future reports and inquiries. So it tells about how important it is that our accounts be set with the right balance sheet or P&L designation. So we're currently on page 8 within the workbook if you're following along there and taking notes. There is a pre-close checklist that relates to the company and the server. So this is an opportunity for you to be able to get your IT staff involved and or outsource IT to get them involved several weeks or months in advance of your close. One of the things that we ask that IT help us with is checking the server disk space. Again, it's typically an IT type of task. It happens in the SQL server, and it asks for a SQL script to be run on page 9 that looks at the minimum number of available megabytes on your server in order to accurately and completely close the year. So, why take any risks? If you're low on memory, this is also the right time to get it fixed before you attempt your GP close. So we're going to check that disk space on the server. We're going to create some folders on the server or on your workstation where you're running the year end. We want to create those with the year end and then the year that's designated. In this case, my slide says 2016. That was a while ago. 2022. We'll make some subfolders, one per company, depending on how many GP companies you have. We're going to set up some new fiscal years. We'll review our master posting and batch recovery to make sure we don't have anything left in those areas. We're going to post all the batches for the year. If you can't post all the batches, then you really aren't ready to close. Now, there is one exception. You do not have to close all of the batches in the sales order processing module. Those sales orders don't have to be completed in order for you to finish, but all of the other modules, it's best if you don't have any open transactions in batches. You're going to want to get everyone out of GP and then do a SQL backup file of the Dynamics and all the company databases. So that function of checking the server disk space is a question of the table properties of the SQL table GL 20,000. And you can see here on this slide the table properties window that you can refer back to or even provide to your IT team who might be assisting with this step. You have a couple of choices when it comes to all of the reports that the period and year end will be producing. You can either print hard copies or you can save them as a .txt file or text file. You also can save them as PDFs if you have some sort of PDF writer installed in your environment. Now, some of these reports can be really, really big. They're just huge. So it could be beneficial to you to not try to print them out on paper, but to print them to a file or to a PDF. We're going to set up a new fiscal year. So we're on page 11. So on page 11, it walks through the actual steps of creating a new fiscal year, which I'm going to log into GP here in just a moment and show you exactly how to do that. If your environment is one that has 12 periods that align with months, then the image on page 11 really provides a framework for that best case. If you're if you happen to be on some other sort of period, something like the 445s where there's 4 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks in each quarter, then that fiscal period setup will be a little bit different than the image, but still very much the same sort of functionality. So let's jump over to our GP and actually create a new fiscal year. So I'm going to jump in here where I can see that I'm in my Fabricam company on my home page. So I'm going to my administration area page, and within the setup section of my administration area page, in the company section, now these are called caret on the side, and when I point the caret or click on the caret, it opens that section. So under company, I'm looking for fiscal periods. So in my Fabricam company, I have already created years out to the year 2027. So if that were actually this year, I would need to create a new year for 2028. So I'm going to type in 2028 into the year and tab. And based on my prior years, GP knows that the first day of that year will be 1/1 and the last year is 12/31, based on looking at the years that I have set up in other prior fiscal years. So I verify my first day, verify my last day, and verify that the number of periods that I want it to produce for me is 12. I can look down this column called date and make sure that I've got 12 periods with the beginning day of each period, and then click on the calculate button on the ribbon. Now, for those of you who may not yet be looking at the ribbon as the header of your record, there should also potentially be a calculate button, as you would see in the image on page 11. The newer interface has this ribbon type format where I can see the calculate with the calculator. And once I click calculate, I now have my 2028 year. I can close that window and open the fiscal periods back up again in order to see that I now have a 2028 year that has my 12 periods in it. Now, I also recommend that any periods that you're not actively posting into, that you close those periods so that someone doesn't inadvertently post forward into a future period that you're not ready for them to use. So within that new year that we just created, I would typically use this close all button to close all of those periods for that coming year until such time as January of the new year comes around, in which case I can come in and individually unmark the types of modules that I have in use in my environment so that those transactions can then post to those open periods. Okay, so let's go back to our slide deck here. We created our new fiscal year. Next, we're going to look and see if we have any users who are actively working within GP. So there is, under the administration area page, a utility for user activity that shows all of the users that are available, or excuse me, that are active within your GP. As of the version of GP 2013 R2, you have the option to send users a message within GP that asks them to close their session if you do see that users are still active within GP. It will actually pop up a message on their GP, asking them to close it, or you can you can identify what message you want for them to receive, right? So You can send those users a message using the administration, utilities, system, and send users a message. The batch recovery window is a place where we would be able to see any of the batches that may have been stuck as they were processing through. Most of the time what happens is maybe an account is missing or inactivated, and so it will push that batch to batch recovery until such time as someone can take action to review what the errors are. So we're going to jump back to GP again and take a look at that. So within my GP, I'm going to navigate to my utilities. Sorry, routines. Sorry. To routines, and here is batch recovery. So within this window, if there were any batches that showed that they needed to be recovered, by checking, putting a check mark and continue, that brings them back into the batch window where you can then go in to the master posting or to each of the module series posting to review those. Then we're going to look at the same kind of routines and master posting. Master posting is the level above series posting, which gives us the ability to see all the batches across all the different series. So I can see I've got some sales transactions, I've got some general entries, and I can use this button at the top to manage between them, where I would see only my financial batches, only my sales or purchasing batches. I mentioned earlier that it is reasonable that you might not want to post all of the sales batches where you might have sales orders, but for things like receivables, cash receipts, those kinds of transactions, you certainly would want to make sure that all of those batches were posted in the sales series, as well as all the batches for purchasing, inventory, and financial. So I'm going to take a little pause right there and check in with Matthew to see if we have any questions.
Yes, we have one question. It's asking, what is the necessary amount of disk space needed on our server?
So the calculation actually is on that page 9 within your workbook, where it calculates what the minimum is and then compares it to the size of that GL 20,000 table. So you're comparing what the space available is compared to the size of that GL 20,000 table that they would do the query for. And as long as the server has um, I think I typically go with twice the size of the GL 20,000 table. As long as you have at least that much space, then you should have enough to be able to produce your year end. Good question. Anything else, Matthew?
No, that was, oh, sorry, one just came in. Will the workbook be sent with the video recording of this webinar?
The workbook was actually a separate purchase directly from the Training Dynamo vendor. I believe that there was a indication of that in the invitation that you got for this webinar, but it's a separate purchase. Okay, so we're on page 15 within the workbook, and it speaks about using navigation lists to be able to check for our open batches in addition to how we did it in the master posting window. So if you choose to use navigation lists, you can also do that in that space. Okay, so backups. This is actually a critical step, critical step. So let us help you before you try to close the year. If you don't know how to perform a backup properly, that's a SQL database backup, or you do not have someone that's trained on how to properly perform a SQL database backup, let us help you. LBMC is here and available to be able to help you through this year-end process as much as you would choose to like to engage us. And this is one of those critical steps that you would want to make sure that you've got covered. So before beginning any module closing process, make and retain a complete SQL backup of the Dynamics database, which is your system database, and any company databases. Do not rely on your nightly backups. Please don't do that. That's a completely different kind of thing for a different purpose. Okay, I think we are ready for our first polling question. I'll give you a couple of minutes there to respond to that polling question. Okay, I'll go ahead and go on then. So our first module that we're going to focus on is in that distribution series called Purchase Order Processing. So within purchase order processing, the period end checklist is part one, and the steps are monthly or period steps that you're seeing on the screen right now. These should be done every month, not just every year end. We're going to enter and review and post all of our POP transactions for the period. That's purchase order processing. So we want to do all our PO shipments, the shipment invoices or enter match, PO returns. We want to delete any unused or empty batches. We'd print the received not invoiced report. That's commonly referred to as RNI report. We're going to balance that RNI report to the balance of the accrued purchases account. And then optionally, we're going to remove the completed purchase orders. And we'll talk about what that means. They're actually not going out of your system in some cases. So our very first step and very important step is we're going to go into the history settings of our purchase order module and uh, look for purchase order processing setup window to look to see that our history settings are set appropriately. We always want to keep the history in our GP. Like we want to be able to refer to things historically, and there are tables that will keep that history separate from our live work and open transactions, but we want that history to be kept. So we need to make sure that these check marks are marked in order to know that that history is going to be kept. So within my GP, I'm going to go to the purchasing area page, and within the setup area, under purchase order processing, These four boxes right here in the center maintain history for requisitions, account distributions, purchase orders, and receipts. So you may not be using requisitions in your system. If that's the case, it doesn't matter that this check mark is marked. I just look for all four of them to be marked. Then I don't miss anything. If you're not using requisitions, it's not keeping anything, but it doesn't hurt it to have that marked. Okay. So that's an important step. You need to validate that you're actually keeping the history. So running the received not invoiced report is done through that same purchasing page where the balance of the accrued purchases account is compared to the report for received not invoiced. So I'm going to go back to GP once more, and I'm going to look for my reports section in the purchasing area page, and under analysis, this down arrow, then I'm going to scroll down to the bottom, and there is this received not invoiced report. You can set up and create report options. Options are just a set of criteria that tell the report what you want it to filter for. I'll click on modify just so you can see that in this case I would want it to be all years, all received but hasn't been invoiced. And then of course I would check my destination to make sure it's going to the screen and not to the printer, and potentially to the file, especially if it's the last period. And then I'll click on the printer so you can see this report to the screen. So represented here is every single purchase order with the receipt number and the quantity in dollars. That should be the number that balances at the bottom of the report to your accrued account, your accrued purchases account. This actually is the subledger for your R&I or accrued purchases account. They should remain in balance on an ongoing basis. There is an SSRS version which allows you to put in a historical point in time. So as of GP 2015 R2, you could enter a cutoff date so that if you didn't run it on 12/31, that you could put in a cutoff date and it would allow you to see that on a historical basis. So that is an SSRS version of the historical point in time received not invoiced report. Now you're going to compare that to the balance of your accrued purchases account, which is often done by going to the financial area page, and in the inquiry section, pick summary, and in this selection you would choose your accrued purchases account and balance that to the report total that we just looked at.
Sandy, really quickly, sorry, we've got a question on what you just covered.
Okay.
Someone's asking that if they do not use POs, can that step be skipped?
Yes. Thank you. So removing completed purchase orders, we're on page 25 in the workbook. So this gives you an opportunity to, because we marked those check marks to keep history, this step gives us the opportunity to move completed POs from open to the history tables. If you aren't keeping history, then completed purchase orders would be deleted from your company database. So you can see how important it is that you first check for those check marks in the history, and then you can do this step to move those to history. Now, backing up your system before you run this process is a valuable safeguard in case anything goes wrong during that removing completed purchase orders process. The purchase order processing does not have a specific year-end close. So just doing those steps we just did, which is supposed to be a monthly step, that then you're complete for your year-end. There isn't any special routine or button utility for purchase order processing year-end. Our next module in the distribution series is the sales order processing period end checklist. So for sales order, we're going to enter, review, and post all of our SOP transactions, delete any empty or unused batches. We'll post all our GL batches that were created by SOP, verify our sales order processing history settings, similar to what we did on the PO side. Optionally, we're going to reconcile and remove sales documents. Now, the one caveat to that, and I'll get to it a little bit more in detail when we get to that slide, is um, if you have challenges with how payments get applied to customers' invoices, then it's possible that you might not want to do this reconcile remove sales documents every single period. But it is useful to do that when you get to fiscal year end if you can make sure that all of your apply functions are completed the way they need to be for year end. And then we would close that fiscal period in the setup. So again, we're going to go verify our history settings. Super important. So I'm going to go back to my GP, and this time I'll pick my sales area page. In the setup area, I'm going to pick sales order processing. And on the options button, mm, oh, sorry, not the options, this one right here. Went a little too far. The maintain history is here on the sales order processing setup to maintain history. All four of those boxes should be marked. Again, if you're not using quotes, it doesn't hurt anything to have it be marked. Then you can be looking for all of those check marks to be completed. While I'm here in GP, I want to speak to that reconcile remove sales documents. So this is under the utilities section of the sales order processing. Utilities, reconcile remove sales documents. So sales transactions typically automatically move things to history when the document's completed and posted. If it's voided, it also does that. However, you might have only transferred part of an order and canceled the remaining quantities. If that happens, it won't automatically move to history. And again, there's some consideration given to payment application as well. So if you find that there are documents that are still showing in open status, you can use this reconcile remove sales documents. My recommendation is that you do individual documents, but if you find that there are long ranges of things that just didn't properly move to history, after you've got everything posted in your series, you can use this range to be able to move them to history in a range as well. You have two choices. You can reconcile sales documents or you can remove completed documents. The other option is to print the report only. This is a great way to verify what's going to happen when you actually process it. By checking this box and clicking process, you are actually only printing the report. Then you can review the report, make sure that it really is all the things that you want to move to history, come back into this window, unmark that print only, make your selections, and process again, and it will actually take the action that you did the report print only for before. Okay, let's go back to our slide deck and see what we have next. So in that reconcile remove documents, sales documents, there is another recommendation here in the slide deck to back up the Dynamics and the company databases before you run that process, right? Um, it's not a hard thing to go back to a SQL database backup if necessary. So it's always nice to have a separate backup that you can restore to that was taken immediately before you do these kinds of utility type processes. So again, with the sales order processing, the period end processes that we just looked at are the same at the end of each period, including the 12th period. And so there is not an additional set of steps for sales order processing year end. There is an optional set of steps for tax year end close if you're using sales tax within your sales order processing. Okay, timing. Timing is very important for payables and receivables. If you enter transactions for the next year before you can complete the closing for things in payables and receivables, then you can either enter them into a batch and not post them, can save them in a batch and not post them. If you do that, you will have open transactions that will not populate all the way through your general ledger. So you would want to make sure in that case that you finished your year-end close during the month of January so that your January close can be effective. Now we're on page 28 and 29 in the workbook if you want to refer there. So there are there are no requirements that you do the enter them into a batch and save them. It is completely okay if you continue to do transactions and post them into future periods. What you need to know about that is that there are some places where the values in some of the screens will not be entirely accurate if you do that. So, for example, in the vendor yearly summary, if you're looking at a yearly summary, but you posted things into the next year, then you would not necessarily see the right information in the year-to-date column because these values roll when the year-end process takes place. That shouldn't be really a problem though, because you can also change this summary view from calendar year into other types of choices to be able to see things in a different way. So in the sample in this window, the 1099 year to date for this calendar year should be 12,895, but GP was closed mid-year. So the year to date amount was swept into last year and the life columns. So you can see that you get a different result when you look at these columns based on when you do the close. So I'll pause there for a moment and see if there's any questions about that timing query.
So the common question that we have is, what is the best way to move POs to history?
Yep, that was that set of steps that we did to remove completed purchase orders. And that would be on page 25 of your workbook or a couple of slides previous where we walked through that. Thank you. Okay, if you do have the workbook, I want to point out that on page 29, our friend Amber shared some of the stories from the GP trenches about some of the things that have happened when the year-end close timing was adjusted or mid-year for 2 years in a row in this particular story. So there's some funny things in the workbook that you can look at that really give you some scenarios where the timing of these things can be a significant part of your decision making. Okay, so we're going to do our receivables management period end close and then year end. So our period close, we're going to post all our AR transactions. We're going to apply unapplied documents, and there's reports or smart lists that you can look at to do that with. We want to age the customer balances. We want to print our historical age trial balance report dated for the last day of the period. And typically you want to keep that because that's something that if you do have auditors, they'll want to be able to see that. We're going to balance that historical age trial balance to our general ledger, to our AR accounts, and then we'll close the fiscal periods for that for the receivables module. So you might find within your GP application, depending on your security, that there are checklists in GP. So for instance, this one under sales routines and checklists that can help you walk through things like period end. But I will warn you, anyone who has access to these checklists, just by opening the item on the checklist, it marks it as complete. They don't have to have done the task for these checklists to mark the task as complete. So what I mostly find is that customers don't choose to use these because they can't actually tell that the accounting staff did the tasks. They just know that they opened the window to do them in. Okay, so on page 31 in your workbook is a checklist that you can use to be able to indicate that things got, sorry, on page 30, you indicate that things actually did get done. You can use that as a check mark checklist. You can take copies of this or however you want to distribute this to your team so that you can mark them or put initials by them. It makes a really nice checklist for you to customize and use as an organization to assure that each of the things gets completed each month. So reviewing unapplied documents, there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. You can do it based on a smart list, or you can do it based on a report that actually exists within GP called unapplied AR. Let's go take a look at those. So again, I'm on my sales area page, and I'm going to navigate first to the report that you can choose to use. So in the reports section, under analysis, is the unapplied documents report. Again, I'll open it up with modified just so I can show you that in this case I have no restrictions applied. Make sure it's to the screen so I can show it to you on the webinar. So this is all of the unapplied documents, and I have 16 pages worth of unapplied documents. That best case scenario is you apply everything that can be, such that you don't have open returns that haven't been applied or open payments or credits that have not yet been applied to your transactions. You can use this first column to be able to see the types of transactions that we're working with to be able to do that apply function. Additionally, you have the ability to open your smart list, and under the folder for sales and the folder for receivable transactions, there is out of the box from GP an unapplied documents smart list. Remember, any of them that have a star at the end of them are ones that come out of the box from Dynamics when your GP was installed. So this smart list can give you the information about the unapplied documents, and you can use this as a smart list to be able to do that same function as opposed to using the report if you choose to. So once we define which things need to be applied, then we're going to use the sales transactions pane here to apply our sales to each other. So in this case, I would use the apply sales documents, look up my customers, and apply either payments, returns, or credits to that customer's open documents. So the Apply Documents window allows you to apply, auto-apply, or unapply sales documents to other documents or amounts, depending on the status of those already applied. So once the AR transaction has been moved to history, you'll need to use the Professional Services Tools library to unapply documents from one another in order to make any changes to reapply to something different. Within the Routines section of the Sales Area page is this option that says Aging. So accounts receivable balances don't automatically age in Microsoft GP. It looks like it because when you run your reports, they seem like they're aging, but this routine really should be run as a part of your period end. This allows you to keep your balances in the same buckets as your collections management might. So there is a collections management module, and this aging also keeps those in alignment between the collections module and the AR balances. Before you run the aging routine, make sure that all the transactions for the period are posted. You don't have to print the report from this aging process. You can choose the no print option and then use the aging report that you typically do from the trial balances. Those usually are the ones that might get modified to add additional buckets or something. So you don't have to print the report, but the aging process is an important one for you to do at period end each period or more often. Our next choice is you can write off over underpayments. So writing off documents has a number of setups within the actual customer card before this process makes sense. So I'm going to say that on page 37 of the workbook, there is a write-off under overpayment process that walks through the steps. Customers have to be set up to allow write-offs. And again, it's typically a good idea to have a backup of your database before you do this for month end so that you can make sure that you don't end up with writing off things that shouldn't have been written off. You'd have a place to restore to if you needed to do that. It also on page 38 gives you the parameters that have to be set up for the customers to make use of that. That write-off documents typically is used most by customers who have scenarios where a customer might underpay by 50 cents or a dollar, and they don't want to go back and collect that kind of small amount from the customer. So they'll set up a limit, say everything under a dollar, and they simply write them off to a different write-off account so that they're not collecting on things that might be considered immaterial to the to your organization. Okay, let's check in on our slide deck here. I think I got a little bit ahead, so I want to make sure that we're following along in the deck. So we looked at that. That's our smart list. We looked at that, which is our AR balances, and we talked about our write-off for our over and under payments. So you will have this in the slide deck to be able to refer to as well. Okay, next we're going to verify our customer history settings. So back here in GP, I'm going to go to, in this case, all of these settings exist not at the module level, they actually exist at every customer level. So I'm going to show you first in the cards for our customers, so like our Aaron Fitz. In the options button here is where I would be able to see that the maintain history is set for this customer. It's only for this customer. So I'm going to give you a couple of ways that you can look at this so that you can look at all of the customers at once instead of having to open every single customer to look and see if that has to be done. So for those of you who are following in the workbook, the Appendix 3 in the back of the workbook has ways for you to be able to look at all the customers at once. So Appendix 3 shows up on page on page 77 in the workbook, and it shows us how to make a smart list to verify those history settings. So it would give you an option to be able to look at all the customers rather than individual customers to validate these. And essentially what we're doing is going to the smart list. We're going to be looking at our sales and the customers. I usually start with the star and then I'm going to add the columns that I want to add to it. And in the columns section, I'm going to click add, and I want to add all of the history settings that came from these records. So all of those start with the word keep. Fortunately, they're all right together. So keep, I can highlight, I can hold down the control key and select all 4 of those fields, click OK, and now I would be able to sort this by each one of these selections so that I could see that there is nothing that says no. They all say yes, and that means that I've kept the history. I've marked those boxes appropriately for all of my customers. Once I've done that, I now have the opportunity to be able to move those paid transactions to history. In the routines section, I'm going to choose the paid transaction removal. You have the ability to be able to do this in ranges if you choose to. You can do it as a range of customers or types. You can also do it as a range of classes if you are using customer classes, which I highly recommend. And then you get this section down here that talks to removal and what dates apply. So for example, the first check mark says to remove NSFs, but we get a date cutoff for that. So if you have customers who still could potentially have non-sufficient funds for a payment that they make to you, you might want to choose to backdate the cutoff for this by 30 days. Usually your bank will have indicated to you that there was a non-sufficient funds within 30 days, in which case you would be able to still have those in the open tables to unapply that payment, mark it as NSF, and move that document back as unpaid until such time as the customer funds the check or provides alternate payments. So by having this cutoff, it leaves those payments in the open tables for a little while longer until you can validate there's no NSF. You also have that option on checks to be able to backdate those for a period until you can get those through the check clearing process as well. I do recommend that you have the check mark marked for print to register, but not for the balance forward consolidation. Most GP customers do not use balance forward consolidation, so I can fairly securely say I would suggest that not anyone do the balance forward consolidation. So printing your AR aging reports takes place here in the reports section under the trial balance. And we're going to print either a historical age trial balance or an age trial balance with options. These are the two that I most recommend. The historical one gives you a point in time, so you can do it for a month-end period, even though transactions have happened afterwards, where you can print to screen and be able to validate that against your accounts receivable GL balance. You also have the one that's got with options to be able to look at if you want to look at a current period aging up to the current date. Okay, we looked at how to use the smart list. We did the paid transaction move to history. And then the last part is the actual year-end close for the Receivables Management module. So printing our historical age trial balance and our aged balance, notice that this clearly calls out for a SQL backup for the Dynamics and the company databases. Then we're going to walk through the close steps for the routine, save the reports, and then we'll come back to our slide deck. So within the routines section of the sales area page is the year-end close. You can either close only the fiscal or only the calendar. So if you have a separate fiscal period end, you can do them separate from one another, or you can do them together. So all this entails is making sure your print report is marked, that you did all the subsequent steps that we just identified, and then click the process button. A report box will come up asking if you want it printed to a file or printed to the printer or printed to the screen. So again, I suggest that you print all of these to a file, save them in the folders that we created at the beginning of our session. And once you've done this step and you've got your report, then you're going to go back to your financial area page into the setup section. Actually, it's administration area page, to the setup section and the fiscal periods, and you would go to the year that you're closing, which in this case is 27, and you would close the sales module so that no one can post anything to that period for the 12th period, because we've now completed the year end. There is an optional routine to close the tax year end. It's under Administration, Routines, and Tax Year End Close. Make sure that you've got your reports printed for any taxability and tax reporting that you may need to, and then you can do the tax year end closing. So here's another image within the slide deck of what that looks like. You will have year-end close reports, right? These reports are what you want to print to file. And this slide talks about the things that are happening and what you can expect to see different after the year-end close process. So the year-end close summarizes the activity since your last close to calculate the last year LYR, last year fields, on a number of different windows. It also clears the activity for year-to-date windows so that it can start accumulating year-to-date values for the subsequent year. Okay, I think we're ready for our next polling question. Okay, I wanted to make mention that if you do the tax year end close, which is an optional close step, it only needs to be done once, either after sales order processing or as part of receivables management closing. It does not have to be done multiple times if you're using both the sales order processing and receivables management and closing both of those ledgers. Okay, we are on page 46. Matthew, do we have any questions?
No questions at this time.
Thank you. So our payables management period end checklist, very similar to receivables. So we're going to review and post our AP batches, check the batch recovery window, print the payables period end reports, reconcile that to the GL, and then close that fiscal period for the payables or purchase module. So printing our AP aging reports, very similar to what we do with the AR ones. So I'm going to go to my purchasing area page, going to my trial balance in the report section. And again, I would pick either historical if I need a month end or the age trial balance with options and print that to the file folders that we've been keeping so that we can have it available and maybe name it end of year or end of that period for period 12. Then I have this year-end prep list that I want to walk through. So ordering your 1099 forms, if that's necessary for you, and envelopes. I have a couple of additional um, details that I want to cover about 1099s. Every new year-end GP publishes a year-end tax update, and the last couple of years there have been changes to forms, like we got the 1099 NEC form as of 2021. As of 22, there were some changes to those forms. It's one of the reasons that staying with your GP up to date to the most recent version, which just came out with the year-end updates as of mid-November, is an important thing for you if you have to file all the different 1099 type forms and want to do that through your GP application. So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the very end of the webinar, and I have another slide to show you then. So verifying your 1099 vendor setups, right? There is another appendix number 5 in the workbook that shows you how to verify the 1099 setups by using a smart list to do that with. So it gives you an easier way to do it than having to go through vendor by vendor and look for them. It also talks about which fields would print on the 1099 forms. Correcting any duplicate vendors. So if you happen to have ended up with a duplicate vendor especially that you need to report a 1099 for, please give us a call and let us help you with that. There are tools that we can use in your system to be able to bring together two vendors into one so that the history all exists under one. 1099 data review. So there is an edit list for 1099s that you can look at. Make any vendor data corrections to the 1099 information. And then this last one, alert your AP team. Make sure the AP team knows when and how you plan to process the close of the year so that they can make sure they've got everything entered and posted before you do the process. They need to have everything ready to go so that you can close with a complete set of records. We're going to verify those vendor history settings. So very similar to what we did with the customer history settings. It happens on every individual vendor, not at the module setup level. So having the smart list to be able to check those vendor maintenance history settings is a very important step as a part of your option. The Payables Management year-end checklist. Again, we're going to print those agings, put them in a file where we have all of our reports for the year end. We're going to do our dynamics and our company database backups. We'll print our forms and then close the fiscal year. So the one thing that I want to point out within GP is on the purchasing area page in the routines where it says print 1099s. This print button versus the print forms button, now depending on which version you have and that you're showing the ribbon version, this print button is what gives us the edit list. So we can look at the edit list without having to print out the 1099s in their entirety. We can look at the edit list, verify things, validate them, be able to know for sure that what we print onto the forms is what we want it to print. So this one's the edit list, this one's the actual forms. Once I've got my 1099s completed, then I'm going in the routines area is my year-end close. Again, I have the option for all or fiscal or calendar. I obviously want to print the report. This button is not on the ribbon like it is on the other one. It's actually at the bottom of the window. Not sure why they're not consistent, but so click on close year. It will give you the option then to be able to print to a file or the window or a printer. I suggest that you print to a file or a PDF. I mentioned there are IRS changes to the 1099 forms and requirements. We have those updates. And as of the 18.4 version, there was support for the 1099 NECs. And this screen shows you what was changed for the 18.5 version, which just came out in November. So this one shows you that it actually prints with lines if you choose to do that. There also is some additional functionality in the later versions that has to do with DBA and new tax types. So again, I'm hopeful that you're all on a very recent version of GP because all this new functionality will assist you when you're doing your 1099 and other form preparation. This window on the slide deck also shows you the 1099 miscellaneous updates, taking NEC off the 1099 miscellaneous form and moving it to a different form. And then we walk through that year-end close in our GP application just now. This talks about the things that are changed by the year-end close, very similar to what we saw on the receivable side. This talks about some smart lists and fields that you can look at after your year is closed. And then our next module that we're going to do is the inventory module. So I think the most important part of this screen happens to be this print hit B reports. So the subledger that was designed and intended by Microsoft to use for the subledger to reconcile your inventory to the general ledger is called the historical inventory trial balance. The stock status was not really designed to balance to the GL, and it actually has some things that don't populate on the stock status. So I recommend that you use the historical inventory trial balance, and we'd be happy to help you if you don't have that already implemented in your system. There is a year-end checklist. Going to run all those reports, balance them to the GL, do a physical count if that's what you do as a typical part of your year-end. Make your Dynamics backups, and then go to the inventory year-end close. So on my inventory area page, in my routines section, is the year-end close. Now in this window, and it's also on your page 59 in the workbook, the recommendation is that you leave all these boxes unchecked. right? If you're interested in knowing more about what these checkboxes do, I'm happy to talk with you about them. But there are some um, less than optimal results if you don't know exactly what you're doing when you choose these things. And there's a separate routine to update the item standard cost, separate from doing it as a part of the year-end close, which is what our recommendation is. So we recommend you leave all these boxes unmarked and click the process button to close that after you've got all your reports in place. So inventory close and what happens, there are no reports that print automatically as a part of that year-end close um, process, but this slide talks about all the things that actually are taking place when that happens. I'll mention this now and again at the end. Please be sure that you don't close GP or walk away from GP while these close processes are taking place. I recommend that you stay in front of your computer, make sure it doesn't go to sleep. You want these things to be able to complete in their entirety while the processing is taking place, or you can have undesired results. The one other thing that I would mention is that there is a reconcile utility that happens most often when inventory is used on a regular basis. So periodic reconcile, so reconciling those inventory quantities. It's under your utilities reconcile, and we recommend that that take place and that you run the report for that as well. Let's see. For those of you who are using fixed assets, the period end processing, you need to enter all the activity for the current periods, including asset additions, changes, transfers, and retirements. Make sure that all of those are in and processed through the general ledger. So there is a separate window that processes those things through GL. Make sure you've got through all those last steps on fixed assets. Create the fixed asset GL transactions and process those through the window. And then in financial routines under fixed assets is the year-end window. Looks like this on the slide deck. Now you can do depreciation for all the books at once. You can also, if your company uses additional books as are listed here, like federal and AMT books, most of the time those really only happen for depreciation at year end. We don't do periodic depreciation for those additional books, only for whatever you call your internal book on a period basis. So you'd want to do that as a part of your year end. Make sure you post this general ledger posting through the general ledger, which creates the transaction, and then post those batches. Then once you've done that, then we'll go back to our GP and we'll look at the year end for fixed assets. So I'm going to be on my financial area page. In the routines section, under fixed assets is year end. Here I can see that I've got my 3 different books. So I would definitely want to do the internal one, and you get to choose whether you do the roll for your AMT and federal or tax type books, but it is recommended that you do those on a yearly basis. There is a report that prints with the year-end close, so you'll want to print that to a file. And then next, after we've closed all of those subledgers, right? We did all the subledgers first. If you remember our little diagram at the start where we walk through all of the subledgers of closing, and then we get to our general ledger of closing. So our general ledger period checklist includes, validating that all of our batch recovery, all of our transactions are posted all the way through our GL. We've made any adjusting journal entries. We've got our final trial balance and our final financial statements. So whether you're using Management Reporter or some other tool for your final financial statements, that you get those all completed. We're going to verify all the account types. So again, in the appendix of your book, your workbook, there is an appendix number 6. It gives you a smart list that gives you the ability to check the account posting type for all of your GL accounts. So I'm going to show you that. I'm going to go back to GP, and in my smart list, under financial, under accounts, I can create a account list that includes the posting type by going to columns. Oh, actually, it's already on this one. So make sure your column of posting type is in your list, and then as long as your accounts are sorted by the account number, typically all of your balance sheet accounts are going to show up at the top. So you can scroll slowly down the list and make sure that all of your balance sheet accounts, which typically are the lower numbers, are set for balance sheet types. After that, then would be my profit and loss types. And if you remember, so you can see here, we might have a problem with these because these are set as balance sheet, but they're down here in my P&L section. So it's easy to spot them in the wrong place when you look at them in the Smart List. You can change those by double clicking on it, which opens the account maintenance window, and this setting for the posting type is what this is looking for your accounts. As I mentioned at the start, the activities or the actions that GP performs is important to that posting type and will decide whether it rolls to retained earnings or whether it closes to beginning balances. So really important. So closing the general ledger is in the, we already set up our fiscal periods. Don't double click the close, and definitely don't exit during the close process. Really important. So we're also going to go and verify in our general ledger setup that we've got our maintain history marked and that we have our posting to history. So as long as this check mark is marked in posting to history, we then have the ability to be able to post another transaction to the last, most recent closed historical period. So what that means to you, if you get audit adjustments in April or May, and you need to be able to post those into that last year, you can still do that as long as this posting to history is marked and the maintain history is marked. So we'll go take a look at that. Financial setup, general ledger. So we're in our setup section down here. And under general ledger, I can see that my maintain history are all marked and my posting to history is also marked. Super important. Back up again. So you can make as many backups as you want to, right? Just have to have someone that can help you with it if you don't have access to do them yourself. This backup of your databases of Dynamics and the GP company databases is critical. Make sure that you have them and that you retain them, right? The retention is a part of what you can provide to auditors if necessary to show that you've got something to restore to. I think we're ready for polling question number 3. Okay, we're winding down. Thank you for hanging in there with me. Matthew, do we have any questions?
No questions at this time.
Right. There is a GL close warning message that you may encounter. So I mentioned earlier that it's not a requirement that you close all the sales order batches. You might need to leave them open because you're not ready to fulfill against sales orders. If you do that, you're going to get this message, but you want to verify that that's the only batches that you have open causing this message. You don't want to have any other batches that are still left open. When you do that year-end closing, the window actually has a progress bar or status bar at the bottom of it. It shows you as it's moving through the process how it's doing, how it's progressing. Make sure that it gets all the way to the end and that it shows you that it's completed. Here in this section, it'll show that it's been completed. Additionally, if you want to maintain inactive accounts, you want to make sure that that check mark is marked. Checkbox is marked. I don't typically recommend that you remove inactive accounts as a part of the year-end close. If you want to remove them, you might choose to do that differently. So mark this box to maintain the inactive accounts and use the separate process. The general ledger year-end close can take a little while. So again, don't double click it, don't end task, don't force GP to close, don't shut down your workstation or the server. Just be patient. It will take some time. I don't know that most cases it takes several hours anymore. Um, Speed of processing on the newer SQL servers means that it doesn't usually take several hours, but it could depending on the amount of data that you have. So please be patient. Print and save that general ledger year-end close report. The year-end close report is the part that is rolling up to retained earnings. So in this screenshot on this slide, you see there's a journal entry number, the date of the transaction, and then the amount that rolled into retained earnings. So you might imagine that this is a really important one for you to be able to have, particularly if you have auditors coming to look. They'll want to know what rolled to retained earnings. You can certainly reprint this journal. It is absolutely possible, but at least it's nice to know what the journal entry number is. You can go look it up if you need to and reprint it. So this window shows the process complete. This is what you would be looking for when the general ledger year-end closing is complete. It will tell you process is complete. So unlike AR and AP, general ledger does not need to be closed before posting to the new year. You can do that at any time. Before closing the year, it is very important to verify those account types. I think I stressed that quite enough. The next several slides reference those appendix. So for those of you who didn't choose to or have not yet purchased the workbook, these are in reference to the same appendix that I mentioned as we went through the slide deck. So this will give you some indication of what kinds of things are available to you. Appendix 2 is for unposted transactions. 3 is to verify those history settings. 4 is setting up those account roll-ups, which you can use to be able to see how things like cost of goods or multiple inventory accounts roll up together. Appendix 5 is for those 1099 vendor setups. And 6 is to verify those GL accounts that we looked at the smart list for in GP. Appendix 7 is reconciling to the GL. There is a routine within GP that allows you to do a reconcile to the GL, which goes out to Excel. It's great if you are struggling with getting your payables to balance to your GL or your receivables. I don't necessarily recommend using this function for the bank reconciliation, but it is available in this window if you choose to use it. And we're ready for our last polling question. Okay, so I mentioned that there is a separate webinar for payroll closing, so that would be what you might choose to do up next. And we will take the opportunity for some questions.
Sandy, so the first question that we have is the year-end closing report available again somewhere if they miss printing it?
It is, yes. Um, the the best place is to have the file created, not to print it out. But if you're talking about the closing journal entry, it's given a journal entry number, and you can reprint that journal entry based on the journal entry number that you would see as the last one for the last year. Additional questions?
I don't see any additional questions. If you haven't submitted them, go ahead, submit them at this time. If for any reason we don't get to it, we can we can follow up after the webinar.
So I wanted to bring this slide back up again just for your indication of what is new and available to you. As of the November 20th, I believe, maybe a little earlier in November, there was a year-end update release that includes these last parts of year-end changes to forms based on what the U.S. government has changed within the 1099 NEC forms. So that would give you the ability to be able to print those forms directly from GP without using any updates to forms within the system and or any outsource 1099 creation processes. So unless there's any other questions, I want to just say thank you. It's been a pleasure to spend an hour and a half with you. I appreciate your feedback. If you'd like to respond to the marketing team who's helping to put together this webinar with any of your feedback about how I can present to you better in the future or things that you would like to see done differently, I am happy to consider all of your feedback with open eyes and opportunities for doing this better in the future. So thanks very much, and I'll turn it back over to Matthew.
Thank you, Sandy. So I know we've covered a lot of information. So if you do think of any questions after this webinar, please reach out to us. We would be more than happy to help you. We will be following up to send out an email in a few days with a link to this recording. It will also include a survey, and we would love to get your feedback on the presentation and learn what topics you would like to know more about. So thank you again, everyone, for attending today's presentation, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.